Holy crap. Terminus. Colonel Corn was a massive man. I would guess 300 pounds of solid muscle, shaped like the proverbial refrigerator, and commander of the Air Transportation Squadron at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. The story was that he had flown F-15s, but nobody knew how he was able to fit in the cockpit or how he came to this command. One thing everyone seemed to know was that he was a drunk and a bully. He had a habit of closing the officers' club and then visiting the Air Terminal Operations Center, ATOC, and generally making a nuisance of himself. This was particularly irksome to me, as I was in command of the night shift there. One early morning, Colonel Corn dropped in loaded to the gills and started barking orders to my subordinates. He and I had discussed chain of command before, and I thought we had come to an understanding. This time I had had enough. I announced, "You've got it, Colonel, I stand relieved." Picked up my hat and walked out as if it were something we had planned together. I returned at 0640 and relieved Colonel Corn before the official day crew arrived and spared him the embarrassment of him explaining his presence. He wasn't happy, but never mentioned nor repeated the offense. Oh, he continued to visit in his inebriated condition, since few places were open at that hour, but tended to keep quiet and merely stagger about and observe. On one occasion, however, his visit precipitated a more significant change in our relationship. The impromptu visit occurred at an unfortunate moment when we had permitted the late departure of a military transport. A priority one piece of hazardous cargo arrived last minute, after space available passengers had been loaded on the aircraft. This required the passengers and their baggage to be unloaded, the manifest to be updated, the crew briefed, etc., etc., etc. It was only a few minutes late, but any delay was considered unacceptable. As officer in charge of the team, I expected a dressing down from the colonel, who had witnessed the entire event, but not in front of my subordinates. While Colonel Corn hadn't said a word, his face was a more luminous shade of red than his intoxicated state would normally provide. Since he seemed unprepared to comment on my breach, I turned my back to record the event in the log. Just then, I felt the powerful grip of Colonel Corn's right hand on my left shoulder. His considerable bulk stood to my left. I looked down at his left hand, which was now curling into a fist. "Orlando, I ought to knock your block off." It took only a fraction of a second to analyze the situation. Realizing that striking a junior officer in front of half a dozen witnesses would surely end his career. His threat was obviously hollow. In the most calm and commanding voice I could muster in the situation, I replied with a bluff of my own. "Colonel, you and I both know that if you were to strike me with that fist, you would probably kill me. But I promise you this, before you connect, I will pluck out both your eyes and put them in your pocket." A moment later, the grip on my shoulder loosened and lifted, followed by a powerful but respectful pat on the back. "Orlando, you're okay." As a result of that exchange, a new and amicable relationship developed, in which we shared a mutual respect. While the early morning visits continued, he treated me more like, not exactly an equal, but more like one of the boys, more friendly and jocular. He would occasionally call me over to his table to buy me a drink when we ran into each other at the O Club. A few months later, Colonel Corn was reassigned to the Pentagon, and sometime later I was transferred to Torrejon Air Base, Spain, where I managed the airport. That's where I met Second Lieutenant Flanagan. Lieutenant Flanagan was ancient, a retired World War II era nurse turned bag lady who essentially lived in military air terminals and traveled the world, space available, on military transport. Her only expenses being food and the occasional room in the officers' quarters, her military retirement and Social Security provided enough to live on. She spent most of her time in the passenger lounge waiting for flights out. Regulation prohibited sleeping in the terminal, but that didn't deter Lieutenant Flanagan, and she eventually outlived her welcome and was forced to take a room. She would then gather up the plastic bags containing all her worldly goods, button up the 405 sweaters she wore, shake her stringy gray hair from her shoulders, and shuffle off in the direction of the queue. Lieutenant Flanagan was never a serious problem, never loud nor disruptive. In fact, she was rather quiet, never saying more than "good day" or "as you wish." Never spoke of her military experiences. This was a shame, since I suspected she had amassed a large collection of stories to relate if one could only get her talking. One morning at about 0500, I received a phone call at my apartment in town, alerting me that the Inspector General team was on its way to inspect my air transportation squadron. Since I was the officer in charge of the airport, I hurriedly dressed and drove to the base. The squadron recall had been initiated, so I could expect my senior NCOs would be on their way too. I inspected my night crew to make sure they were recently showered and shaved and dressed in clean-pressed uniforms with shined shoes, buttons buttoned, and hair combed. I didn't have much to worry about. My folks were in high-profile positions and knew that they were under constant scrutiny by transiting passengers, and so always tried to make a good impression. Nevertheless, it didn't hurt to check. Next, I inspected the facility to get any spilled soft drinks or visible trash cleaned up and collected, then went in search of any potentially sleeping transient passengers. Wait a second, there's somebody sacked out in the baggage rack. As I approached, I recognized the miscreant as Lieutenant Flanagan. I confronted her. "Wake up, Lieutenant Flanagan, we've talked about this. You know you're not allowed to sleep in the baggage rack." I gently shook her. "Come on, Lieutenant, wake up. The IG's inbound. You have to get up." She didn't move. Beginning to panic, I shouted, "Lieutenant, wake up!" No movement. I put 2 fingers to her throat, cold and no pulse. Oh my God, she's croaked. The IG's aircraft would be on the ground in less than 10 minutes, and I had a stiff in my passenger lounge. This could be the end of my otherwise unsullied career. There would be time later to chew out the staff sergeant in charge of the night shift for overlooking the corpse in our baggage rack. But right now, action was required. I grabbed the phone and called the base hospital. "Medical emergency. You need to send an ambulance to the PAX terminal ASAP. This is a medical emergency and the IG is on final approach." The short wait for the ambulance seemed like an eternity, but when they finally arrived, they worked quickly and professionally, put the deceased on a gurney, and exited through the front door in their hasty obsequies as the 8th member of the IG team entered the terminal by the rear door leading in from the flight line. Just as I was taking my first breath in 15 minutes, I heard a familiar voice, a voice I hadn't heard in 2 years. The bourbon-scented voice that had boomed in my ear in the ATOC. My old pal. "Hey, Orlando, have you got your car here? Take me to the queue. Tonight we'll go downtown." I replied, "You're on, Colonel Corn. Looks like we're going to pass the inspection after all."